There are friendships forged in the dust of movie sets that the world never fully understands. There are rivalries invented by publicists and gossip columnists that never truly existed. And then there are relationships that defy easy categorization. Two men, two legends, standing on opposite sides of a camera lens, each carving his name into the granite of cinematic history in his own way. The story of Lee Van Cleef and Clint Eastwood is precisely that kind of relationship. Not a rivalry, not a brotherhood. Something more complicated, more honest, and ultimately more interesting than either of those simple labels could ever capture. For most of his career, Lee Van Cleef said very little about Clint Eastwood in public. He was not a man given to interviews filled with sentiment or score settling. He was private, disciplined, and deeply serious about the craft of acting in a way that left little room for the kind of celebrity gossip that Hollywood has always fed upon. But in the later years of his life, as illness drew closer and the noise of ambition quieted, Van Cleef finally began to speak. And what he said was not what anyone expected. It was not bitter. It was not resentful. It was something far more powerful than either of those things. It was the truth delivered with the same calm, piercing clarity that had made his eyes so unforgettable on screen. To understand what Van Cleef eventually said about Eastwood, you first have to understand who Lee Van Cleef was before their paths ever crossed. He was born on January 9th, 1925, in Somerville, New Jersey, into a world that would soon be shaken to its foundations by economic collapse and global war. He grew up during the Great Depression, in a household where hardship was not an occasional visitor, but a permanent resident. That environment shaped him in ways that Hollywood never fully appreciated, at least not at first. He learned early that nothing was given freely, that patience was not weakness, but strategy, and that a man's character was defined not by the ease of his circumstances, but by what he did when everything was difficult. He served in the United States Navy during World War II, and that military experience left a permanent mark on his bearing and his psychology. There was a straightness to Lee Van Cleef, a kind of internal architecture built from discipline and duty that never left him. When he came home from the war and turned toward acting, he approached it the way a soldier approaches a mission, with preparation, seriousness, and an understanding that the outcome was never guaranteed, but the effort was always within your control. His film debut came in High Noon in 1952, one of the most celebrated westerns ever made. It was a small role, largely silent, but his face, angular, sharp, with those extraordinary pale eyes, made an impression that was impossible to ignore. Hollywood noticed him, but Hollywood, being Hollywood, noticed him for all the wrong reasons. Those striking features that would eventually make him an icon were initially seen as a limitation. He was too threatening-looking to be a hero, too unconventional to carry a romantic lead. So they put him in the corner of the frame as the villain, the henchman, the man you were meant to fear rather than follow. Throughout the 1950s, he worked steadily in westerns and television, appearing in series like Gunsmoke, The Lone Ranger, and Have Gun Will Travel. He was good at what he did, exceptionally good in fact, but the roles rarely allowed him to demonstrate the full depth of what he was capable of. He conveyed menace and intelligence with extraordinary economy, using posture and timing and the precise angle of his jaw rather than theatrical technique. He was doing serious work in a space that wasn't ready to take him seriously. And then, in 1958, a car accident further complicated everything, momentarily threatening to derail a career that had already been moving in fits and starts rather than with the smooth momentum of a rising star. Clint Eastwood came from a different world, even though their backgrounds shared certain broad strokes. Born in 1930 in San Francisco, Eastwood had also served in the military, had also knocked around Hollywood in the early years without breaking through, had also found himself trapped in a category that the studio system found convenient but limiting. For Eastwood, it was the television western rawhide that kept him employed and visible throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, but it was not enough. He was becoming a recognizable face without yet becoming a star of the magnitude his instincts told him he could be. When Italian director Sergio Leone came looking for an American actor to anchor a radical reimagining of the Western genre, Eastwood was not the first choice. He was not even close to the first choice. But he took the opportunity when it arrived, traveled to Spain, stood in the dust and the heat, and delivered a performance in A Fistful of Dollars in 1964 that rewrote the rules of what a Western hero could be. He was cool where others were passionate, minimal where others were theatrical, and dangerous in a way that felt genuinely unpredictable rather than safely choreographed. The film was a phenomenon, and Eastwood became, almost overnight, an international star of the first order. Lee Van Cleef watched all of this. He watched it from the margins, still playing supporting roles, still being cast as the man in the shadows rather than the man in the light. And then, in 1965, Sergio Leone called him too. For a few dollars more changed everything for Lee Van Cleef, and he knew at the moment he read the script. He was cast as Colonel Douglas Mortimer, a bounty hunter with a personal mission that went far deeper than financial reward. It was not a villain's role in the traditional sense. It was a complex, morally layered character shaped by loss and driven by a code that existed outside conventional notions of justice. Mortimer was the kind of man that audiences had never quite seen before in a Western, and Van Cleef understood immediately what an extraordinary opportunity this represented. On that set, for the first time in his professional life, he stood as a co-lead rather than a supporting player. And the man standing across from him was Clint Eastwood. Van Cleef spoke about that first encounter with Eastwood many times in his later years, and the consistency of his account is striking. He did not describe tension or competition. He described recognition. Two professional men who understood each other at a glance in the way that people who have worked hard and struggled long often do. There is a mutual respect that formed quickly, a shared understanding that both of them were there to do serious work, and that the film they were making together was something genuinely new. Clint knew exactly what he was doing, Van Cleef said in one of his most candid later interviews. He had already developed something that most actors spend their whole career searching for. He had found the center of himself on camera, and he was absolutely still inside it. I respected that immediately. It's harder than it looks. What Van Cleef eventually told the truth about was not Eastwood's talent. That was never in question. What he told the truth about was the gap between their trajectories and the complicated feelings that gap produced in a man of Van Cleef's dignity and self-awareness. He was 5 years older than Eastwood. He had been working in Hollywood longer. He had paid dues in small roles and forgotten films, while Eastwood had risen with a speed and completeness that felt almost theatrical in its efficiency. And Van Cleef, being an honest man, acknowledged that this asymmetry was not always easy to sit with. I would be lying if I said there were no moments of reflection, he admitted. You look at someone moving faster than you, reaching heights you had imagined for yourself, and you ask questions. Not about him, about yourself, about the choices you made, the breaks that didn't come, the time that passed. He paused in that interview, in the way he often paused on screen, letting the silence carry weight. But reflection is not resentment. I want to be clear about that. Clint Eastwood did not take anything from me. He went where the road took him. I went where mine took me. That distinction between reflection and resentment is perhaps the most important thing Lee Van Cleef ever said publicly about his fellow actor and his own career. It was a statement of profound self-knowledge from a man who had spent decades developing exactly that quality on screen and off. Van Cleef also spoke with remarkable frankness about the difference in the way Hollywood perceived them, and what that difference revealed about the mythologies that American cinema has always been in the business of constructing and protecting. Eastwood fit a particular American archetype with almost uncanny precision. Tall, laconic, handsome in a rugged and unthreatening way, heroic without being soft, dangerous without being truly alien. He was the frontier myth made flesh, and Leone recognized that and used it brilliantly. And American audiences, when they eventually caught up with what European audiences had already understood, embraced him completely. Van Cleef did not fit that archetype. He could never have fit it. His face was too sharp, too angular, too genuinely unsettling in its quiet intensity. He did not look like a man you trusted. He looked like a man who had seen things and survived them and drawn conclusions from those experiences that he was not necessarily going to share with you. That face, which had been a professional liability in the 1950s, became something extraordinary in Leon's moral universe, where the categories of hero and villain were deliberately blurred, and the most interesting men occupied the gray spaces between. Leon understood my face better than Hollywood ever did, Van Cleef reflected. He didn't see a problem. He saw a story. Every line, every angle told him something about the character before I'd spoken a word. That's a director who's really seeing you. That changed everything for me. But he was careful to add, with characteristic precision, that Eastwood's success within the American mythological framework was not a simpler achievement than his own success outside it. Clint had to protect that image constantly, he said. Every choice he made, every role he accepted or refused, every interview he gave or didn't give, was in service of something carefully constructed. People think it's easy to be a symbol. It's not. It's the hardest kind of acting there is, because you're never really off. In their scenes together in